Just waiting for people to have a minute to log in, but we'll get started soon. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Friday Night Forum. Really excited to have you with us. This is the last one for the month of May, and our topic, as I'm sure you know, this evening is Abolition and COVID-19. Um, to get us started this evening, we will have Nicolas Cruz from the Red Nation. Nicolas, you want to get started?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last Friday Night Forum, at least for the time being. As Rachel said, today we're going to be talking about abolition. Friday Night Forums are a partnership between the Arab Resource Organizing Center, AROC, and the Center for Political Education at the Red Nation. They provide an anti-imperialist perspective and lesson on organizing around the world. My name is Nicolas Cruz, and I'm a member of the Red Nation based here in Oakland, California. I want to start out by acknowledging that there's been a lot going on in social media and with uprisings around the country, and with the recent killings of multiple Black people by police. This topic takes on a renewed urgency, right? And hopefully that's kind of the energy that is driving you to be here today. And we appreciate you being here in this time. In this space tonight, we wanted to hold the memories of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and Drayshawn Reed, and the countless others who have been killed by police, inside of prisons, in migrant detention centers, and by vigilantes. We want to extend our love and solidarity to the people of Minneapolis and Tallahassee and cities across the country that are rising up against their killing by police, and we join in their calls to abolish the police. Even though the police officer who murdered George Floyd has been arrested, we know that this is not justice, nor is the system capable of delivering justice to us. So we encourage people, if you have the financial means, donate to the organizations like Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective and the Minnesota Freedom Project, as they're collecting donations for people on the front lines. We'll share a link in the comments later on, so you can go ahead and follow that and donate. But I want to kick off this conversation briefly before the activists and scholars talking about abolition by explaining what we mean by that and how it relates to other movements, especially indigenous liberation, right? It is important to remind ourselves that this nation was founded by an emerging European capitalist class and relied on stolen indigenous land and stolen African people's labor to work it. Indigenous prisoners of war who fought against the violent encroachment of settlers were held in forts, rounded up in reservations, and jailed in places like Alcatraz, which is actually not too far from where I am right now. As colonized peoples resisted the spread and violence of US empire, prisons became a disposal site for political prisoners, a way to isolate leaders and disrupt resistance movements. Today, forms of incarceration range from local and county jails to state and federal prisons, migrant detention centers, and military prisons like Guantanamo Bay. Together, all these forms of incarceration are used as a tool of class warfare and social control, locking away human beings rather than addressing the contradictions, the negligence, and violence of settler capitalism and colonialism. So those of us who believe in decolonization, like in the Red Nation, the end of settler colonialism and the liberation of indigenous peoples everywhere, which is the end of settler colonialism, sorry. Abolition is a necessary parallel movement because of the use of incarceration, surveillance, and policing in maintaining settler colonialism. Abolition of the prison industrial complex, which we'll hear about later, the state and private interests that sustain and profit from incarceration, involves the ending of these coercive practices and violent institutions. But some abolitionists also use the term abolition democracy, which we'll hear more about as well, as a way to think about more broadly, right? Not only ending prisons and police, but also transforming the social and material conditions that surround prisons and criminalization, and instead replace them with institutions that allow our communities to live with dignity and self-determination. This means the abolition of capitalism, of imperial war, borders and border patrol, and settler colonialism itself. In the words of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who are two abolitionist theorists, it is the abolition of society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. So this is what the Red Nation kind of had in mind with our recently released Red Deal. It's a three-part document that lays out a path towards environmental justice through decolonization and revolution, not through bargaining with the settler state. It calls on our comrades and allied organizations to fight for an earth that is habitable to everybody, which includes the ending of incarceration, border enforcement, and policing. It begins with ending the occupation by divestment from the military, taking money out of the military, the police, prisons, border patrol, and reinvesting that money into alternatives that support our communities and our Earth's well-being. We believe that what creates the crisis cannot solve it, right? So for example, increasing police on tribal lands will not solve the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, when the police and the oil companies that they are protecting are the main perpetrators of violence against Indigenous femmes. We also believe that calls for abolition must come from below, that even politicians who have called for abolishing ICE or free them all or closing prisons do so because of social movements that have brought these demands to the forefront. It is with people power, not politicians or electoral organizing alone, that abolition will be achieved. So how does this fit into the current moment we are in? Prison abolition is not a new movement, right? This has been happening for a very long time. People have been working on it, evolving it to what it is today. But with COVID-19 spreading and now reaching millions of prisoners, threatening their lives, abolition has become more necessary and even more widespread, right? A lot of new people are calling for it. People are calling for the release of all inmates, of migrant detainees, and tonight we seek to build upon this emerging momentum. And as we see in Minneapolis and Tallahassee and across the country, even a pandemic cannot stop the police from murdering people, nor does it stop our resistance to it. And so we will continue resisting. So tonight I want to welcome our comrades here to share lessons from the work of abolitionists in the US and internationally that can help guide the movement in these times. So with that, I'll pass it back to Rachel, our moderator for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. I want to thank Nicolas not just for that opening statement, but also for all of the work that he has put into pulling this forum together tonight. It's really his idea and his labor that brought us all together tonight. So thank you for that. As usual, tonight's forum is being recorded. It will be available on the Red Nation's YouTube channel after tonight. It's also live streaming right now on all of the organization's Facebook pages. So you can see it live streamed at the Red Nation's Facebook page, at AROC's Facebook page, and at CPE's Facebook page. And if somebody's having a hard time getting in, that's another place that they can check things out. This forum, the planning for it started months ago. And as Nicolas mentioned, we want to acknowledge the fact that George Floyd's murder and the protests that have been following it may be on a lot of people's minds tonight. The forum is not going to be about that, but I certainly think that probably there will be things that come up in the discussion that will be useful for our understandings and to help us be involved in taking action as we see appropriate. We have 3 presenters this evening. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Emmy Rakete, and Mohamed Shehk, and I will introduce each one of them before they present. And I also want to thank the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and Critical Resistance, who have brought us some statements from imprisoned people that we'll be sharing through this evening's webinar as well. So how things are going to work tonight is that each person will have about 15 minutes to present. I'm going to pose a couple questions to everybody, and then we'll see how time is. Time permitting, we'll start taking questions from attendees as well. You can pose questions for any of the speakers in the chat function or in the Q&A function if you're on Zoom. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can also leave questions in the comments section on those pages. So before I introduce Ruthie, I'm going to share a statement that we received from California Coalition for Women Prisoners from somebody who is imprisoned at California Institution for Women. A lot of us just got tested for COVID-19, and I come out positive, so we had to move to different units with all of our property. One woman came out negative, which is good because of her health, but she also had to move where we are with positive people. It is 6 days and she's still here. I'm in the positive unit or hallway. Medical staff or the doctors are not providing medicine or antibiotics for no one. No drinking water for us either. They say drink lots of water, but what water? We don't have any water. We only shower when they want us to. We can only make a phone call or email when they want. I keep asking for my medications and they just keep ignoring me. 222 means medical emergency, but when we call, they don't respond. We kick doors and they just ignore us. We don't know what to do. They don't even give us cleaning stuff to clean our cell. I've been in here about 5 days and they said that we have to be here for 15 days, then retest. We have 2 negative people who have been in here for over 30 days on my side. One of them keeps showing the paper that says negative even to the sergeants, and she is still here. So I want to introduce Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who is a co-founder of Critical Resistance, a US-based grassroots organization working to abolish the prison industrial complex. She was also an organizer of the organization's inaugural conference. She is also a professor and a writer who works in local, statewide, national, and international struggles to achieve justice, equality, and freedom for all. Ruthie has also co-founded organizations that include California Prison Moratorium Project, a network called Californians United for Responsible Budget, or CURB, and Central California Environmental Justice Network, and other grassroots organizations. She currently works with activists in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. So Ruthie, I'm going to turn things over to you right now.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. Hello, it's 1 o'clock in the morning where I'm at. So good night, good morning, good afternoon. It's good to be here with friends old and new, comrades around the world. And I want to give a shout out to my friend Debbie Kilroy, who I believe has dialed in from Australia. I have a brief that was given to me to get our discussion going today. I'm going to talk a little bit about abolition. I'm going to talk a little bit about why abolition is so crucial now. And then I'm going to talk a bit about internationalism and its absolute centrality, its importance to everything that we do. So what is abolition? Abolition is a vision rather than a blueprint. And it is a vision that enables us to look at the presence of what people are already doing to free themselves, to free the land, to free the world, and to take that presence and figure out how to put it together so that we topple colonialism and racial capitalism. In other words, abolition is not possible without decolonization. Even if for some people, but not the Red Nation, decolonization could be possible without abolition. But the other way around is impossible. My friend Vijay Prashad, whose work many of you probably know, he's a writer, he's written more books than anybody I know on the planet, and also one of the founders and energetic people in the Tricontinental Institute, said about the third world, he said, the third world isn't a place, it's a project. And abolition, like the third world, is a project, and it's a project that is coming into being all the time in many, 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 many places. So I will talk in a few minutes about some new work that people who are dotted around the globe are doing to lift up the work that is happening in a number of places. But at this point, first, I want to talk a little more about abolition itself, the kinds of things that people have been doing for the last 25 years, and how we can think the future together. The Trinidadian Tobagan Toronton lawyer poet Norbeza Philip wrote recently, "If we were truly all in this together, we would not all be in this together." And her poetic understanding of what we and all means for different kinds of people is at the heart of what abolition is and should be. So while abolition over the last 25 years is very strongly associated with ending the prison industrial complex, as Nicolas said in his opening remarks, the prison industrial complex is only possible because of all of the societal contradictions that make the PIC seem to be a solution, whereas what it is a displacement of how racism works, how class struggle works, how gender inequality works, how heteronormativity works, and how the nation state, internationalism, and empire work. In other words, the prison industrial complex is something that is not surprising when we look at how racial capitalism has unfolded for the entire period of modernity. And also, we can see at the present moment, around the planet, wherever inequality is the deepest, prison is used the most. Wherever it's the deepest, prison is used the most. So the United States is off the charts, Brazil is in hot pursuit, South Africa is in hot pursuit, as is the United Kingdom. India is starting to flex its muscles as well. So it's not even a matter of only looking at the white settler colonies to see the pervasive presence of the prison industrial complex. It is part of the central contradiction and therefore a central antagonism for all of us who are trying to decolonize the world. So if abolition is present and abolition is a project, that means also that what abolition isn't is a litany of complaints. I could complain for the rest of my 12.5 minutes that we're together today about all the things that are wrong with the world, and some of us will, in the Q&A, probably return to that. But where abolition differs from a recitation of complaint is that what we are trying to do in everything we do, including this forum, is rehearse a future that is a free future, to rehearse a decolonized future in our interactions tonight and beyond. Indeed, a young writer and novelist, and I think he might also be a sociologist, called Edouard Louis, wrote in a book called Who Killed My Father, the following. Said, for some people, for people whose consciousness is very much clamped by racial capitalism as the only way to be in the world, that capitalism is somehow natural rather than a relation of power and difference. Edouard Louis said that for some people, for people whose consciousness is clamped there, politics is just a matter of style, how they feel about themselves or prefer to feel about themselves. And certainly a lot of the criticism that is coming up in the wake of the uprisings in the United States today is voiced by people for whom this is not the style that they want to imagine themselves being political through. Whereas, my friend Edouard Louis writes, what politics really is, of course, is a matter of life and death. Politics is a matter of life and death. And the life and death struggle is what the Third World Project was, which is what decolonization is, which is what abolition is. So in thinking politics as a life and death struggle means that abolition is constantly looking for the presence that already exists in what people do every day. And at the same time, we understand that what people do might not look that radical until it all adds up. We were talking earlier this afternoon about how many people are doing abolition work, and if you were to ask them if they were abolitionists, they would pull back and either deny it or think that's somebody else's thing or think it's a style, as I was talking about earlier. But what abolition as presence gives us the opportunity to think about, and in fact, the imperative to think about, is something that C.L.R. James taught us a really long time ago when he gave a talk, actually, in Port of Spain, where he was born in Trinidad. He talked about how revolutions happen because people are conservative. And by conservative, he meant people try everything. They try and they try. They try every little thing until, he said, one day people come out in the streets and clear up in a matter of years the disorder of centuries. And I think that in the context of what is happening now, not only in the United States, in the cities that have been mentioned, but in a number of other places around the world, people are coming out in the streets to try to clear up the disorder of centuries. However, that coming out in the streets and clearing up is not a matter of exclusively abolitionist or liberationist work. And there are certainly fascist tendencies that are in the streets as well, that we must all pay very close attention to. So perhaps another way to think about abolition as presence is to lift up what the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense said of their own practice in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And what they said was that they were involved in survival pending revolution. Survival pending revolution. And survival sounds very bare, but it need not be. And it sounds very simple, but we know that is not true. My comrade Ayana Maria of Rust Belt Abolition Radio thought that maybe she could rephrase what's happening today and say that what we do is abolition, that what we are engaged in is survival pending abolition, survival pending decolonization. And as I said, abolition is not possible without decolonization, whether or not for some people, decolonization might seem possible without abolition. At the moment, with this pandemic, what many people have in the front of their minds, whether they're locked up or in the free world that's in flames or the free world that is not yet in flames, wherever they are in the world, is staying alive and trying to figure out in the short run how to be alive, who to talk to, who to send a message to have it read into a webinar that shoots around the world, as well as thinking about what it will mean when this huge political economic depression that we are sliding into unfolds and what will happen on the other side. This crisis, I think, and many others think, is also an opportunity to think very hard about how to enliven and extend the kinds of projects, the kinds of decolonial and abolitionist projects that will make possible a sturdy infrastructure of solidarity across borders, across territories, across oceans, around the planet, so that the world we want becomes the world we need. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes. I think I have, where's my time? How am I doing on time, Rachel?
You have 3.5 minutes.
Right on, that's what I thought. Great, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about internationalism and abolition and framing. Many people who are listening to this webinar probably know that in 2001, a number of people got together and started an organization called Insight Women of Color Against Violence. And the purpose of Insight was to take a very big step away from carceral feminism and to work radically to diminish and eliminate violence against women of color instead of helping the police perpetrate violence against people of color, allegedly in the name of remedying already existing violence against people of color. And Insight challenged critical resistance, which when we were then in our very nascent years as an organization, challenged critical resistance to take seriously the problem of violence against women of color. That was the outset. That has changed over time. In order to put at the center of abolition an understanding of harm and the urgency of its remedy of the prison industrial complex. The statement that came out from CR Insight became a working document. It was used all over the United States and North America in workshops and seminars for people to think about and debate and figure out how we could all move away from carceral feminism and move toward a truly liberatory agenda that included liberation of communities from violence perpetrated within communities, and work toward transformative justice. So my last 30 seconds is to tell you that a group of people from around the world have been drafting a statement, an internationalist abolition statement modeled on the CR Insight statement that is looking from the ground up and from lofty heights down at the combination and the interconnections of the war on terror, imperialism, global capitalism, settler colonialism, gender violence, a particular but not exclusive focus on Palestine, and a number of other urgent issues. The purpose of this new document is to bring the work of the organizations, that the people who are writing it, together and lift the work up so that people in as many organizations and as many communities as possible around the world, not around the country, could use the document, fight through it, make it better, as happened with the CR Insight statement, and perhaps, we hope, lift abolition as an international and urgent agenda in the time of this pandemic to a new level of connection, organization, and usefulness. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ruthie. It's fantastic. I'm going to read another one of the statements that we've received, also from inside CIW, the same prison as I read from earlier. This is another statement we got from the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. I tested positive and have been moved to another unit, and now I have gone 9 hours with no mattress. They wouldn't allow us to bring a mattress, and they are ignoring all of my calls to get one. The officer told me to hold on numerous times. I'm logging all of this. I even got his name. He's about to leave and go home, yet my bunkie and I have no mattresses. I'm so sleepy, but I have to wait up to catch someone. It's midnight, still no mattress. In 25 years, I have filed one grievance. That shows you how much I complain. Since contracting this virus, I have been treated with disgust and disdain. In 25 years, I have never slept or went without a mattress. Now that I have this virus, I'm not allotted one. I have a documented chronic condition from medical that I'm supposed to have 2 mattresses. I'm denied even just one. It is 12 midnight and the first watch staff continues to ignore me. I've told 4 officers since 1:30 p.m. that I do not have a mattress to sit on or sleep on. Now everyone is sound asleep but me. I have absolutely nothing to sleep on. I don't know how to file a lawsuit against this place, but I'm going to start with a 602, which is the document that the Department of Corrections here calls an inmate appeal form. I already have back problems, and now my back is hurting so bad. I'm emotional and all over the place. This is hands down the worst experience I have had in 25 years of being incarcerated. I have also been asking for toilet paper and sanitary supplies since 1:30 to no avail. I have not had one sheet of toilet paper in almost 12 hours. A few rooms are screaming for toilet paper. 2 a.m., still no mattress. My bunkie fell asleep on the floor waiting. I just put a cover over her. 2:30 a.m. Just got a mattress and the room's got toilet paper. The guard told us to step back, and we did. And he threw the mattresses in the room. Then his partner started using his foot to kick them in the room further. They both laughed. The one who wasn't kicking the mattresses looked at my bunkie and said, "Don't ever say I didn't do nothing for you. Just evil." We had no disinfectant to wipe his boot prints off the mattresses, so we used our body wash and most of the toilet paper roll he gave us to clean them. They really hate us, and they are not hiding it. I'm going to get some sleep. Next, I would like to introduce Emmy Rakete. Emmy is a doctoral student and a community organizer from Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In 2015, Emmy helped to found PAPA, People Against Prisons, Aotearoa, a prison abolitionist organization that's raising broad structural critique of the punishment system. Both her academic and organizational work center on the role of criminal justice in class struggle. Emmy, I turn it over to you now.
Awesome, thank you. First of all, I think it'd be a bit ridiculous for me to come to something like this and not talk about what's happening in Minnesota and across the United States right now. Yeah, it's really incredible. Last night we couldn't sleep. Both of us, me and my partner, just stayed up in bed reading the news and seeing what was happening as it was coming in. And I don't know what to make of it at first, because I think none of us are really ever taught that things like this can happen, that these kinds of ruptures can happen and can work. But then I saw the revolutionaries of Minneapolis burn a police station to the ground. I saw cops fleeing on foot and in cars out of a police station as the revolutionary working class of Minneapolis seized the police station, stole all the riot gear, and then burned it to the ground. So from all of us, and I guess I'll try to speak for the entire revolutionary working class of the planet, to all of the revolutionaries of America right now, you have our hearts in your fists. So who am I? My name is Emily Rakete. I'm a Ngāpuhi and Te Raro woman. My ancestors started about 2,000 years ago, all the way up in what is now the People's Republic of China, and then spread out in a big diaspora all across the Pacific Ocean, and we ended up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I live in Auckland, which is our biggest and most multicultural city. It's where kind of all of the crises and contradictions of capitalism in the South Pacific all come to a head. So we're simultaneously the largest Polynesian city in the world. We've got the highest population of Pacific Islanders anywhere. And we also are one of the most unequal cities in the world. We're the place where all of these problems come to a head. And that's taken different forms over time. And so when I was asked to be on this panel, at first I said yes, first of all, because I'm really, really thrilled to be here, but I had to think about what it is that I can bring to this and what it is that I can bring to all of you. Because I could just say some kind of communist-y stuff and we could all nod, because we're probably all on the same page about that. But I don't know that that's a uniquely useful contribution that I can bring. So what I want to try to do today is look at some of the particularities from our organizing context here in Aotearoa, and look at how these can be applied around the world. And I hope that there can be something useful that comes out of that for all of you. When there are pitched street battles with the police going on, it can maybe seem a bit self-indulgent to start talking about theory and history and trying to glean intelligence from stuff that we've done before. But as a Marxist, I think that for me, I find it really important to be informed by history when we make these kinds of organizational decisions. So I'm going to try to look at things that are unique about New Zealand. I want to look at some things that are similar between Aotearoa and the United States of America, and try to pick at, in the next kind of 12 minutes or so, try to pick out some lessons that will be applicable for people who are in the US, because that's who I imagine most of the audience is today. Before I keep going, I probably have a quite weird accent to all of you. You all have quite a weird accent compared, from my perspective, but I'm not the audience. So I'm going to try to talk a bit slower than I usually do, so long as you all try to listen, and we'll get there together in the end. So in terms of contemporary issues in policing in this country, they will not be unfamiliar to Americans. I'm Māori. We're the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're about 15-ish% of the population. Hasn't been a good census in recent years, so it's hard to know kind of precise demographic information like that, but about 15% of the population. So not entirely dissimilar to the demographic makeup of African Americans in the US. And just like African Americans, we have really similar issues in terms of disproportionality in terms of police violence, disproportionality in terms of mass incarceration, disproportionality in terms of being made to live in poverty, in terms of debt, in terms of racist government policy. So there's never a clear analogy when we're looking at geopolitics in the world, but this is a decent one. The African American experience is very similar to what Māori endure in this country. I'm going to jiggle my camera a little bit. Oof. For People Against Prisons Aotearoa, what this has meant is that there are a lot of things that we could be dedicating organizational time to, because there are a lot of problems that need solving. And I'm sure everyone here who's involved in politics knows what it's like to be faced with this awful, awful world and trying to pick one thing. So this has meant that we've needed to focus on issues-based campaigns, which has got strengths and weaknesses. It means that we're kind of forced to be in quite a reactive position at times, which I don't think is an unfamiliar kind of situation for people in the United States. The main waves of anti-police organizing has come in the wake of killings by police. That's pretty similar here, but because we have a much lower population, there's about 5 million of us here. It means that these incidents of violence come further apart, and it means that there is less of an opportunity to leverage them to try to build organizations. So it can mean that it can mean being quite responsive, and that often puts us in a worse position because it's the state who is acting, and then we're put in the kind of in the role of responding to it. But it also means that we're capable of leveraging the news cycle quite effectively. So one of my roles with my organization is doing press work, which is despite the fact that I end up being put in front of the cameras all the time, not actually the most important thing that we get done. The most important stuff that we get done is campaigning, which is hard to do when we're locked into this kind of reactive model of responding to state violence when and where it occurs. I think trying to break out of this reactive model is really important. And when we've seen it happen here, the results have been really, really impressive. So one of the major examples of kind of skipping this paradigm and being the ones to act and forcing the state to be the ones who have to respond has been around the land struggles. This will not be unfamiliar again for Indigenous peoples in the United States and around the world who always find ourselves in the role of trying to defend our land from being taken off of us. That's kind of the foundational reason why colonialism occurred, right? Captain Cook wasn't just sitting at home and deciding that he didn't like the thought of brown people being out there somewhere. Captain Cook had an economic job to do, and he did it well until Native Hawaiians finally murked that guy for all of us. So land struggles have been historically one area where Māori have been able to set the agenda in terms of resisting state violence. And for abolitionists, that means direct strategic confrontations with the police. One of the major kinds of land struggles in Aotearoa recently has been at the Ihumātao occupation, which some people from the states who I've talked to have heard about this and some haven't. So I'll hash it really briefly. Huge Māori grave site taken by the government in the 1800s and now trying to be used for private development of $1 million homes for rich people. Indigenous people don't want that to happen, so there's been a long-standing, long-running occupation to basically make the land undevelopable. If you can't drive a bulldozer onto it, then you're not going to build houses there. And so this kind of hit a flashpoint about in the kind of latter half of last year when the police did try to seize that land back. And it meant that this was a major flashpoint for abolitionist struggles. You can write a lot of press releases and articles and even do great videos about how abolishing the police is a strategic necessity for the class struggle. But if the cops are cracking heads, you should probably be there. And so we went there. And similar to the kinds of abolition struggles that are occurring in Minneapolis now, that meant like on the ground fighting with the police. This is not, I think, an aspect of doing abolitionist work that we should neglect. I'm really, really interested in theory. Got a lot of bookshelves in this place. But if we don't know how to defend ourselves and fight back, it doesn't matter how good your analysis is or how good your critique is or how incisive your critique is. The cops will shoot you in the head and torch your car and say that you did it to yourself. So figuring out how to engage in these kinds of struggles in a way that's sustainable for our organizations, in a way that diminishes the power of the police to directly take down these kinds of counter-hegemonic moments, and figuring out how to tie these into a wider political project, I think is a really important part of doing contemporary struggle. And it's something that the people in Minneapolis right now are doing really, really well. I've seen people from all around the world, from all kinds of leftist tendencies that do not necessarily get along very well, throwing their support wholly behind contemporary struggles in the United States. So that's really, really important part of making sure that this stuff works well. For a relatively small country like us, we raised tens of thousands of dollars overnight, basically, in order to keep this land occupation running. And so this kind of alternate economy, I think, is really important. When I approach organizing work, part of what I really rely on is Sun Tzu, who, despite what generations of CEOs say, is actually still really helpful for all kinds of work and not just thinking about how you're going to carry out a takeover. But Sun Tzu provides a really useful model for organizers because Sun Tzu takes seriously the fact that we're at war, whereas a lot of other political theory, I think, comes from this very abstract or metaphorical kind of way of thinking about politics. Well, I don't think that we have the luxury to be indulging in metaphors or in simile or an analogy. We are at war. There's a war on the street of Minneapolis right now. I was watching the fights this morning. All of us, I think, have seen the stakes that we're in right now. And Sun Tzu argues that in war, it's not necessarily the tactical or even the strategical work that we do that's the most important. For Sun Tzu, one of the defining factors of how you win in conflicts like these is logistics, in terms of organizing, in terms of having systems in place that function in order to put situations together that we can win, that help us achieve our strategic goals. So when I saw that in Minneapolis, people were looting a Target and then setting up depots to distribute resources to people, that's how we win this fight. At Ihumātao, we had an enormous, we had like shipping containers that were being loaded up with goods that people were bringing in, stuff like firewood, stuff like barricading material, all of these material, in like military terms, all of this material is a manifestation of an abolitionist agenda, something that we can bring out of books and out of theory and into the realm of political conflict. These battles that we fight aren't just to push the police out of a specific area, not just out of a neighborhood or away from a barricade by a field that has Māori bodies buried in it. But these are part of how we push the police out of our ideology. It's part of how we contest the kind of ideas that policing is an intrinsic part of how we can organize our lives, of how we should organize our lives. By demonstrating, first of all, that they're not unbeatable. You can just chase them away. People do it. People can do it, and people have done it. This is the work of politics, and I think it's something that, while we all take it seriously, we don't necessarily plan for it. I think when moments of rupture, like the one that we're seeing in Minneapolis occur, then we should start taking it seriously and start to figure out what it would mean to win. What would it be to fight an abolitionist struggle in the streets? We're starting to figure that out, but we can't know until we really get going. That's why I was really, really flattered to be invited to this panel, is because I see all of the people who are here today, and I count people who are participants and who are getting in the chat now. You guys are starting to take these questions seriously and starting to figure out what the tactical and the strategical and the logistical solutions are to the problem of police domination. When we take class struggle seriously as our worldview for working out what it means to be abolitionists, we can start to figure out how to win. And I really want you guys to win, and I know that you guys really want us to win. So it's my pleasure to be able to offer up what I can in terms of some insights that I've gleaned from organizing here. It's been my pleasure to try to coordinate what support we can offer from here to you. So from all of us here, mate ururotia, and we'll see you in the streets. Victory to the riot.
Thank you, Emmy. Appreciate your comments. I'm going to read one more statement here. This one is from Stevie Wilson, who's based in Smithville Prison in Pennsylvania. Stevie is a regular contributor to the Abolitionist newspaper that is run by Critical Resistance. Stevie says, "It's a mixed bag in Pennsylvania. We are not allowed out of our cells for more than an hour. There really is no plan to protect us. Very few people think about the imprisoned during times of crisis. But what has been amazing is the incredible support and push from outside supporters and allies. A major effect of this showing of solidarity is the fostering of a cooperative mindset among prisoners. We realize we need to work together to get through this. That has been a major plus. In Pennsylvania, we have Zoom visits now, which has enabled prisoners who haven't had visits in years to be able to see their loved ones. The Pennsylvania Department of Corrections is working to keep these visits going after the crisis. The governor released 1,500 prisoners by order of reprieve. We are seeing decarceration. It took a pandemic for people to realize we can empty these prisons and jails and still achieve public safety. Prisons are never safe. Before, during, and after COVID-19, prisons are inherently violent and unsafe spaces. What I would like to see is the continued push to decarcerate, support for those recently released, and strengthening of connections between folks on both sides of the walls. We have to stay connected so we know what is really happening in here and out there. Always, Stevie. So next I'm going to introduce Mohamed Shehk, who is the National Media and Communications Director for Critical Resistance, described earlier. He has supported Critical Resistance's campaigns and projects to shrink and end policing programs, fight new prison and jail construction projects, and close down existing cages. He's also been engaged in amplifying international solidarity with people's struggles outside of the United States, supporting the Palestinian movement for liberation. Mohamed, I turn to you now.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And I also just want to take a moment to thank Ruthie and Emmy for providing us with some really inspiring and amazing comments. And I thank the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the Center for Political Education, and the Red Nation for inviting us to speak today. I was tasked with speaking about the organizing and kind of some of the work that Critical Resistance has been engaged in. But I want to start just by talking about this moment that we're in and contextualizing it in kind of how we as prison industrial complex abolitionists are approaching and engaging this moment. So PIC abolitionists have long held that imprisonment and policing are toxic, harmful, and destabilizing to our communities here and all over the world. And I think Stevie's words that you just heard echoes that sentiment exactly. I really encourage folks to visit Stevie's website because he's an extremely sharp person that is prolific in writing. We've long understood that these systems, the logics that undergird them, are also not confined to any geography, but are global in nature. We've long fought for the elimination of these systems while at the same time simultaneously fighting to build the resources, practices, and infrastructures that truly create strong and healthy communities. And at the end of the day, our success really rests on the strength of solidarity and internationalism. There's no better case than the need for abolition, probably, than the health crisis that we face today. For CR and the numerous organizations and movements that have been fighting against imprisonment and policing, the onset of COVID-19 has amplified what we've been saying for decades. To the mainstream, this pandemic has in many ways unveiled the nature of imprisonment as unhealthy, toxic, and violent institutions. But the importance of this is that COVID-19 really provides us an opportunity, and it's a political opening. With local and state governments scrambling to contain the pandemic, what is made possible is radical pushes for decarceration. The pandemic is a crisis in many ways, and I'm actually going to quote Ruthie here in describing crisis, which Ruthie writes, "Crisis is not objectively bad or good, rather it signals systemic change whose outcome is determined through struggle. Struggle, which is a politically neutral word, occurs at all levels of a society as people try to figure out through trial and error what to make of idle capacities," end quote. So this health crisis in many ways has created a new terrain on which to struggle. As organizations, organizers, and communities in resistance, our task is to sharpen that struggle through organizing, movement, and coalition building, advocacy, mobilization, and strategic action. And it's to push as hard and as far as possible to dismantle the prison industrial complex in this time and to ensure that the systemic change that will inevitably happens in our favor, right? So I want to talk a little bit about our work. So what does abolitionist organizing look like in practice? First, it's a matter of thinking strategically about what we want to shift, change, or address. We want to be fighting for things that we don't have to tear down later. So when there are instances of police violence and a lot of mobilization and outrage against that police violence, do we want to demand equipping police with body cameras as a response to that violence? For abolitionists, no. We want to be stripping away the power, the tools, the resources that policing has, not adding to their arsenal of surveillance capabilities. So in some of the campaign work that Critical Resistance has been engaged in, so we won a huge victory just this month with the No New SF Jail Coalition in getting the city of San Francisco to shut down a jail that has been in operation since 1962. Without replacing it. And I want to emphasize this point because one way the prison industrial complex has grown is through reforms and changes that are argued to be necessary for improvement, right? So whenever there's a prison or jail that communities want shut down, whether that be here in California or Rikers in New York City, those in power will come back and say, we just need a newer, better prison. And no matter how hard or how many statistics are thrown at us to argue that a new prison or jail is needed, abolitionists must reject this reasoning and line of argument outright. We're not going to abolish the PIC with a newer and shinier PIC, right? The fight to close this jail started in 2018, which came after a victory we had in 2015 in defeating a plan for a new jail to replace the one that we successfully got the city to say they wanted to shut down, which is called 850 Bryant Street in San Francisco. When COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders came down, San Francisco jail population was at 1,100. Over the course of the next month, it dropped almost 40% to 700. This drop was the result of organizations and institutions, including the No New SF Jail Coalition, in making demands for the immediate release of people, right? So we understand very well that those who are in charge of running the prison industrial complex, the sheriff's office that oversees the jail, is not going to release people out of the goodwill of their offices, but as a result of people making demands and pressuring. And we're seeing similar reductions in jail populations across states, right? So we saw reductions in New Jersey, and in Los Angeles. The Justice LA Coalition has been doing an amazing job in pushing for releases. We took advantage of the moment and the urgency. So the pandemic was quickly revealing how much of a public health disaster the imprisonment system was. And we worked with decision makers' offices to push ahead with the legislation to close the jail, not despite the pandemic, but because of it, right? And I'll also say that in the coalition, the strength was really the diversity of the coalition and the commitment. And you had different kinds of organizations, people that have different interests that are coming together with one shared goal of fighting imprisonment and shutting down this jail because it is harmful to all of us for different reasons, right? So you had organizations that focused on public health, and they were saying that imprisonment is a public health issue. And especially in this pandemic, if you care about anyone's public health, you have to care about the health of people inside during this pandemic. We had organizations that focused on houselessness and saw that the need for investments in affordable housing and guaranteed housing for people was actually challenged and threatened by the fact that we were spending so much money on locking people up. And the fact that I believe it's around 35 to 40% of the imprisoned population in San Francisco that were houseless before being locked up, right? So it's issue that affects that community in certain ways. And we had folks that also cared about like the public funding and where that money is going, the San Francisco taxpayers for public safety, right? So it was a very diverse coalition and a committed coalition to shutting down this jail. And it was in this COVID-19 moment that we actually won our demands. And the organizing there was certain challenges and certain ways that we had to shift, right? We couldn't mobilize in person anymore. So we took to social media and we doubled down hard on making phone calls, taking writing emails, and meeting with people digitally, right? And I'll just one of the decision makers in San Francisco had named that that they had never gotten this many calls before like 2 p.m. because of how much we were mobilizing people to make phone calls and flooding their offices, right? I want to also just shift and talk about our Portland chapter. So our Portland chapter started Care Not Cops, which is a campaign to abolish the Portland Police Bureau's gang enforcement team, to oppose any increases to funding for police, and to redirect those funds to community resources and life-affirming infrastructure. With the onset of COVID-19, the campaign scaled up its organizing to demand the immediate release of people in prison, jails, and detention centers across the state of Oregon. And some of the work that they've been doing is responding to the moment in a way to uplift the voices of community members that actually have been kind of censored and silenced in many ways because of the way that the city has responded to COVID-19. So the city goes through a budgeting process. They canceled budget hearings as a result of COVID, right? And what Care Not Cops did is solicit video testimony from people and screen those on a gigantic truck outside of City Hall, right? And made sure that it was live streamed and that that the council members and the mayor were paying attention, right? And they've been putting forward demands on ending the gang enforcement team, on ending school police and transit police, right? And actually this year, though they didn't win those demands yet, those have been put on the table as actually practical things that we can achieve, right? So they have been thrown into the negotiations of the budgeting process. So that's a pretty significant thing to make possible. So I guess with that, the role of abolitionist organizers is to make practical what is visionary. As Ruthie stated, abolition is presence, and it's on us to materialize that presence through struggle. And I also just want to name the importance of connecting with imprisoned organizers and supporting prisoner organizing. We have had to shift a little bit in our correspondence with people and be able to take calls from inside remotely, but are still sharing resources with people inside and responding to the requests that we constantly get from people inside on connecting with folks on the outside. I want to just end. I was asked to share some lessons from the organizing. So a couple of lessons that we have are, that I just want to uplift, are in our fight against imprisonment, one thing that we must always reject is only demanding freedom and relief for people who are locked up for low-level and non-serious charges, right? We can't ignore everyone else, right? We're seeing how even with some gains being made now in reducing the imprisonment population in different places, there's very little movement around freeing people that the state deems unsafe. And so rather than accept the state's dehumanizing and unfounded definition of safety, it is on us to make the point that prisons, jails, and detention centers, as Stevie noted, are themselves unsafe and have never been safe, right? I also want to uplift that, especially now in this moment with George Floyd and the outrage, the rightful outrage in Minneapolis and in other cities across the country, is the need to target policing and fight policing. Major cities are having to cut budgets because of COVID-19. The one thing that continues to be prioritized is funding for policing, right? I really want to uplift in this moment the work of the Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block in Minnesota, who are demanding cuts to the policing budget and are asking council members to make a commitment to no longer fund or approve increases to the policing budget. And those are the kinds of abolitionist demands that we want to be uplifting in this moment, right? I'll also just end with something that I actually learned from Rachel Herzing, is that we must be demanding what we want and need, not what we think we can get in this moment, right? The conditions shifted so rapidly as COVID-19 spread, and I think what it made possible took a lot of us by surprise. So demands for decarceration, for housing and healthcare for all, for example, just months ago seemed out of reach and are now on the table as real possibilities and on the horizon. And so we must not limit ourselves by fighting for what we think is a compromise or what we think is made possible, but really demanding what we want and need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. Especially that last point was very, very poignant. Appreciate you raising it. Thank all of our speakers so much. I learned new things, which is always exciting for me. Before we get into attendee questions, I have a few things on my mind. I'm wondering if I can run by you all. I think, I appreciated a lot, Ruthie, the kind of framing that you did around abolition as a project, right? So I come out of organizing around prison industrial complex abolition, which is a fairly specific thing. But if we're thinking in terms that kind of Nicolas was laying out earlier around kind of abolition democracy, what is the kind of future we want to build? What are the institutions we're required to have in place to have the kinds of futures that we need? I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more, kind of building off what you were talking about in terms of rehearsing the future, and also where you started to take us around the openings that COVID-19 pandemic offers to us. Can you say a little bit about kind of what those openings suggest for the kinds of futures that we might be rehearsing for, and what's required of us to build, in this period? And any examples of building you've seen that you want to raise up would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. The kinds of examples that have me the most excited, things that I've been involved in, and also things that I've observed but have not been involved in other than as a really close observer, has been work that people have stretched around, for example, the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, between here, where I am now in Portugal, around the Mediterranean, but then out to the Atlantic and down through places like Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde and on to the south. And the kind of work people are doing is connecting issues that are issues everywhere else as well, such as the necessity for long-distance migrants to be able to move, and also the necessity for long-distance migrants to be able to stay still. Like, those are two sides of the same coin. And so that people are connecting up demands against the police state, demands for regularization of residency, of documents, insofar as documents continue to be a requirement, but also doing very broad-based public education of various kinds in order to, what's the word I want? I want the word conscientize. Conscientization, which comes to English from Portuguese, which is a language I actually can speak, is the word that means awareness in the really deep sense, right? So consciousness, becoming to consciousness. I want to show you something. I have to reach it. So, for example, there are young activists here in Portugal who come across abolition work that people like Mariam Kaba or Rachel Herzing or various folks have done that's available in English. They translate it into Portuguese or to Creole, Cabo Verdean Creole or Guinea-Bissau Creole, and make up these little unauthorized translations, authorized by the people who wrote them, but they don't ask permission first, and hand these out, and then use these documents as a way to help people who are learning to read, whatever their age is, to read and think about abolition and a different way of being in the world, and then pair things like this with, oh, I don't know, like say a citizenship application, so people can read back and forth and see how the official forms that insert somebody into the official state compress your mind instead of opening it. So people can fill out the form because they need to. Nobody's telling anybody not to fill out a form that they need, but they also have this as part of what the reading is. So that's an example. Other work that's been happening that has been very meaningful to me is how people in the States and elsewhere have been working over many years in very strong solidarity with, in particular, public sector unions, also with faith organizations, neighborhood communities, artists, tenants' rights organizations, and so forth. So all of these elements of possibility, trade unions, social movement, grassroots social movements, and so forth, form a pattern of interaction that people can look at and try to rehearse into their reality, but also stretch across space. And so the statement that I was telling you about in my opening remarks is really something that came out of that kind of work going on for a really long time. And the moment at which the possibility and the usefulness of such a statement became very clear to a small group of us was when a person who has done work as a legal observer, but also somebody who defends people who have been arrested in Somalia and Afghanistan and places, various places around the world under US determined international law on terrorism charges. So she is a defender of such people. She is the one who first said out loud in front of some people, her name is Zora Ahmed, what we really need in thinking hard about the war on terrorism is something like the CR Insight statement, because it's not as though the war on terrorism is this binary thing. It's got these multiple aspects to it. There is contested territory, say the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, for example, one among many. There are people who are struggling on the ground against certain forms of hierarchy and violence, as well as struggling against the imperial state. And all of this has to come together. So I was thinking about when Emmy was sharing with us about the struggle in New Zealand, and I can't wait for this statement to be in shape so that y'all in New Zealand can read it and beat it up and make it better. And shoot it around the world. So I hope that Rachel answered your question.
That was great. Thank you, Ruthie. Um, Speaking of these openings again, on this question of openings, Mohamed, you were also mentioning some of the openings that happened that created some space for organizing. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how you balance out the openings that you've been seeing created by the pandemic, whether that's, the Free Them All campaign that's been happening nationally, that's had really good traction, getting people um, paying attention to the health concerns of imprisoned people regarding the pandemic, or it's the ability to press the city and county of San Francisco to close 850 Bryant, or it's the attention, other allies have been getting for the work that they've been doing around clemency or, medical release. How do you balance that kind of those kinds of openings, which I think we should always name and exploit to the extent that we can, with some of the increased criminalization that we're also seeing during the pandemic? So, for instance, the criminalization of people wearing masks or not wearing masks, or wearing masks in ways that cops don't like them to wear masks, or some of the perils that we've been hearing our comrades at organizations like Stop LAPD Spying Coalition warn us about, in terms of the potential of contact tracing, surveillance, et cetera. How do we balance those kinds of openings that we see for pressing abolitionist goals further with also kind of the openings that the state's going to take to continue to do the work that it's trying to forward as well?
Yeah, that is a great question, and there is no easy answer. I would say, what's interesting is the way that question breaks down in this kind of like along the same lines that I noted earlier, where it's like there is some traction that we're seeing, some, not complete and not as much as we need, but some traction that we're seeing with people being released from mainly jails, right? While there being a hardening or a re-entrenching of policing, right? And surveillance. So I think that first I want to just uplift the work of organizations like RAP, Release Aging People in Prison in New York, the California Coalition for Women Prisoners here in California, for really lifting up the Clemency Now campaigns. And the reason I lift those up is because not just because they're amazing organizations and politically solid, but they don't go after, say, the low-hanging fruit, right? They go after elderly prisoners that are serving life sentences without parole, which, if and when it becomes possible and the victories are won for those people, it makes winning for everyone that much easier, right? Because if we can make the case that the people who the state deems as quote unquote the most dangerous, that those people are deserving of freedom, then everyone is deserving of freedom, right? In terms of balancing some of that with the re-entrenchment of policing that we're seeing, is I think that's a struggle that we came up in our fight in San Francisco, for example, where on the one hand you had an agreement, or general agreement, that this jail, 850 Bryant Street, had to close, while that was also being paired with increases in police funding, which would shoot the jail population up, because more cops on the street mean more people in prison, which means more people locked up, right? So I think that the strategy has to be twofold, is that we can't just focus on the prisons and the jails without looking at the police. It has to be both. And we have to fight both as two-pronged strategies because of how intermeshed those systems are, right? And the other thing I'll say is that around surveillance in this moment particularly, is I think that the danger is, and again, this is kind of like going back to that definition of crisis that Ruthie provides in Golden Gulag, is that we have to oppose the normalization of the prison industrial complex and the practices that it will put forward as ways of dealing with this crisis, right? The repressive ways, so instituting like contact tracing and surveillance capabilities, it'll be like, well, we'll just do this because this will help us address the pandemic. What's going to happen is that that's going to become the new normal, and that's going to become the default surveillance technology that is going to be used to criminalize people and lock people up and police people, right? That doesn't really answer your question, Rachel, about how to balance, but I think we have to be strategic in what we take on, and what are things like that we can anticipate becoming new structures or new normals that we actually have to just make sure to wipe out from the get-go entirely and not normalize.
It was swerved like a pro, though, Mohamed. I appreciate it. And this will be meaningful to some of you, but that is straight out of the Rose Braz School of Media training. So you answer the question you want to answer regardless of what gets asked. But I feel like you actually answered my question as well. Emmy, speaking of crisis, I think you did a really excellent job of talking about kind of the different ways that we need to think about how we engage, whether that's, in direct confrontation, or that's also thinking about, learning our history or our context. I have a special place in my heart, obviously, I think, for political education and the role that helps us in fighting smarter and better, getting more of what we want. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the role that you think political education can play in helping us navigate these crisis periods.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about this. So, crisis is really important for us, right? Like, there would have been no Soviet Union if there hadn't been a World War I. But we can't just like conjure crisis. They'll make our jobs way, way easier. Just telling everyone to just go and cause crises if I thought that was like a possible thing for us to do. But we can't just rely on a crisis happening whenever it will be helpful for us. And this is the point of education, right, is being prepared for these crises when they occur. And they do occur, and they have to keep occurring because capitalism is not a particularly stable system. That's why the American president is trying to start a war with China in 2020. Crisis is going to occur if the capitalist countries keep acting the way that they have to act if they want to continue existing. So we have these cyclical crises that happen over and over and over again. And this is what we need education for. This is what we need logistics for. So that when these things come up, we're capable of responding to them in an effective way. If we've got crises but no political education, we'll just do the same strategies over and over again that fail. I like a lot of people were probably involved in Occupy when Occupy was happening. I was involved in Occupy, but just because I was a teenager who liked smoking weed. But I'm sure people here had like a more political involvement in Occupy. Which was dope. I think Occupy was a really cool thing that happened, but the strategies did not work out. We didn't pull it off, not least because I was just there to smoke weed. Maybe it would have worked if I'd been more committed, but if we don't have political education, if we don't continue to build on our own historical analysis of why things worked and didn't work, we might just keep doing the same things over and over again, and that means we waste perfectly good crises. Coronavirus is happening, and this is a crisis. America is going to hit 30% unemployment really, really soon. What some people online have been calling the cool zone. We need to know how to take advantage when countries like America fall into the cool zone. And that's what political education is for. So one kind of example of this from my historical experience, looking at Aotearoa, in 2008, there was a series of massive raids carried out by the state on rural Māori communities looking for guns and on anarchist and socialist groups across the entire country, alleging some kind of Maoist-style plot to overthrow the New Zealand government with like 100 people, which wasn't real, for one thing. Literally, they weren't doing that. If you're rural in Māori, you hunt for food because you can't afford to buy food. So that's why there are a lot of unregistered rifles kicking around. But what this movement did was demonstrate in a really, really strong and visible manner what police are for. There was, you know, photos of armed riot cops in full SWAT gear pointing assault rifles at little children and keeping them like hostage for hours. And on its own, that happened doesn't do anything for us, right? Things like this happen all the time and nobody knows or sees about it. But when you take the occurrence of these things and you incorporate it into a story, like a genealogy that makes sense to people, and say, the cops shot your ancestors in 1845 to steal your land. The cops held your kids at gunpoint in 2008 in order to maintain a grip on the economy. And now the cops, this is a contemporary struggle for us, now the cops are putting armed patrol cars in your community in order to keep you under control. They've always been doing the same shit and they're never going to stop doing it. And that's why we need to fight back. That is a convincing message. And it's one that only works if you do this kind of political educational work, if you do this kind of propagandizing, which is why I'm here, which is why we're all here, because we're building the story, right? We're building the genealogy and adding to it like a big kind of woven mat, demonstrating over and over and over again to the people why the struggle is important, why this class struggle can only be resolved in one way. And when we do that firmly enough, when we do that solidly enough, when there is a moment of crisis and we are prepared and we've won the people over, nothing can stop us. And we've seen it happen in Russia. We've seen it happen in China. We're going to see it happen all over the world. But it's on us to build that tapestry first.
Thank you so much, Emmy. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now to go back to where Nicolas opened us up to talk a bit more about decolonization and abolition. We've had a series of questions about that. One specifically in reference, Ruthie, I think, to the question that you had raised around if decolonization can happen without abolition or not. I think people would like some clarity on that. And then any other kinds of reflections that any of the panelists have. And Nicolas, I would encourage you to jump in on this too, if you like, on the relationship between efforts for decolonization and abolition.
Ruthie, you want to start this
Me?
off?
Okay. Am I back? Okay. All right. I'll say a few things. First of all, it might be that for some people, the word decolonization has a special resonance, which is different from anti-colonial, post-colonial, or any of those other words. And if it does, then perhaps I'll stand corrected. But if it doesn't, and if for some people, and I keep encountering this in the world, decolonization seems to end at something called self-determination, which might include the perpetuation of prisons, criminalization, and so on and so forth, then I'll say, as happened in many places around the world, the colonial forces can be run out of town, but if the structures remain, then they remain. So that is what I mean, and that is all that I mean along those lines. We had a big debate almost 20 years ago when this being prison moratorium project, California, Critical Resistance, and a bunch of other organizations brought together urban and rural organizers in California's Central Valley in the effort to stop California from building what was then going to be its 24th, I think, new mega prison. The prison was built to hold 5,600 people. And what we were doing in this meeting, in this conference, was bringing together issues that motivated people to organize themselves for environmental justice, issues that motivated people to organize themselves on behalf of themselves and their communities as farm workers, motivated people to organize themselves because they were worried about endangered species in excess of humans being endangered, and so forth. So we got all of these people together, urban and rural, and had somebody give a keynote talk. And the keynote person, whose name I won't repeat right now, argued that if Native American communities wanted to establish prisons on their sovereign land, they had a right to do it. And I was like, no, I just don't agree. I don't, so that was the kind of fight from 20 years ago about decolonization, sovereignty, and abolition. And that was a big fight. It wasn't just one person's opinion. It was a struggle over what self-determination means. So when I spoke earlier in my remarks about rehearsing the future, this connects very much with what everybody else has talked about in this webinar about the necessity for not establishing something today or agreeing to something today that we have to destroy tomorrow. Even though we will always make mistakes and agree to something that we're going to say, oh, shoot, and have to go after it, but never yield at the outset or follow Cabral's advice. And on the one hand, claim no easy victories, but on the other hand, gather the actual real victories and look at them and say, what have we made? So that we can see what we should make tomorrow. So, I want to say one more thing and then I'll be quiet. That just to lift up what Emmy was talking about, or I understood Emmy to talk about, concerning the instability of capitalism. That is its dynamic, is its instability, not its stability. And the way I like to think about it is that we are living through round after round of capitalism, saving capitalism from capitalism. And the kind of surveillance that they're all putting their heads together now, allegedly for public health, having apps on your phone and so on and so forth, is yet another example of that, as is all the asset stripping that's happening when all of these hedge fund people fly to the finance centers of the world and take trillions of dollars and other monetary units allegedly to resolve the economic problems of the pandemic. So.
Great, thank you, Ruthie. Any of the rest of you want to jump in on that question around decolonization?
Yeah, I can just real quick, and Ruthie has already said this, but that to kind of clarify that, yeah, the Red Nation does believe that both are necessary, right? That we can't have one without the other. We can't have decolonization, right, and then have native-owned prisons, and we also can't have a settler society that has no prisons, right? Those two are co-constitutive. So definitely agree with you there, and thanks for that clarity.
I want to just name or uplift one thing, which is that I think it's really important in this moment, as the communities are in resistance and in mourning over the death of George Floyd, is to also recognize the role of policing in colonization and settler colonialism in this country. And that the fact that the origin of policing in this country is, as many know, is closely tied to patrols tasked with capturing people escaping slavery. And so that there has never been a time when policing wasn't about racial control and the repression of people fighting against that control. So I think when looking at what happened with George Floyd, is that that's not an example of bad policing or policing gone wrong, but that's an example of policing. That's what policing does and is. And I think that the response to that should be around reducing and eliminating the powers that policing has. And as much as there might be some like vengeful satisfaction in sending the officer that killed George to prison, that's not going to eradicate the power that policing has, right? So I think I just want to name that as an abolitionist offering in this moment, and why the demands around the policing budget and disarming them and getting rid of the tools and practices that they have is so vital right now.
Thank you all so much for that. I want to close with one last question, which draws from what you were just talking about, Mohamed. And that's a question of kind of demand and strategy in this period. And, you know, I think we've been seeing in this past week just a rush of people jumping on board to demand, on the demand of defund the cops, right? And, you know, to I think a point you were making earlier and the point you were just making, Mohamed, I'm wondering about that demand in this period when 6 years ago there was a rash of demands to abolish the cops. And that strikes me very much as like a step backward, right? Because if we don't dismantle the institution of policing, it doesn't matter at some level if they have money or not, right? And I wonder, you know, kind of what you all think about that from an organizing perspective, but also what are the kinds of demands in this period that we should be making when there are these openings? And again, keeping in mind your point, Mohamed, that, you know, we can't think effectively about policing without thinking about imprisonment, without thinking about sentencing, without thinking about surveillance, right? Which is why we talk about the prison industrial complex, rather than just kind of abolish the cops or abolish prisons or whatever, right? Can anybody share thoughts that you might have on kind of what that suggests for our organizing strategy and demands?
I will very quickly say that that making a demand is one thing, and I think it's ever important and crucial to have that vision and make those demands. But you're going to get the goods with a strategy. That's what's going to get you the goods, is having a strategy and a strategic plan of action about how to do that. And I think the piece around like targeting the budget of the police is one strategy. I think that you can, there's other ways that you can limit the police power, eradicating the power of police unions, right? The contracts that police have, and that allows them to be able to, you know, have like their own separate officers' Bill of Rights and that kind of thing. But I think it's important when thinking about organizing and having long-term sustained organizing efforts to have a strategy that will materialize your demand. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, and also I think that you're like that's it, right? Like if we don't have something that can materialize the demand and show people that we're not just pissing around, why would people stay interested in us? You know, like you can make a Twitter account for free and just like type guillotine all police 24/7. You're probably right, but that's not going to win the people over, right? It's not the kind of work that builds the movement that we need. But there's the problem of there's hard limits to the kind of society that we live in, right? There's hard limits on what we're capable of achieving within a society that's structured like this one. Yeah, I'll quote Lenin. So Lenin talks a lot about the point of doing politics, like the point of doing parliamentary politics. And he's real cynical about it, which I appreciate, because I think there's a point where we need to start being really cynical about parliamentary democracy, or you don't call it parliament in the States, I forget, where maybe we're asking for stuff that we actually can't get. And so I don't think that there's no utility to doing so, but we need to be making demands that people actually want, that the system's not capable of achieving, so that we can say, the system's the enemy that we have to fucking get rid of. And it's, I think, a really tactical question of when do we ask for these kinds of budgetary, like slash the police budgets, which of course we should do that? When do we ask for these goals that we know we're capable of achieving, even when we know that they're not going to solve the problem? And when do we make these kinds of demands that we know can't be met, but which demonstrate to the people the limitations of the system we live in? I think if you only speak in these kind of maximalist terms of destroy the police now, you don't really get very far. You impress weird people online, but you maybe don't get very far. But if you only make these minimalist demands, people get sick of that too. And I think people start to see it for what it is. And so, yeah, trying to find the right balance between those two is really, really difficult. I'm sure that I tend towards demanding guillotines more often than I should. But we need to strike that balance, that we don't look boring or unhinged.
Am I here?
You going to comment on
Okay.
that, Ruthie?
Yeah, I would like to briefly, and that is, I'm glad you brought up Lenin, Emmy. The whole time I was listening to you, I thought VI would have appreciated you very much. We're at a moment where that people should go and reread What Is to Be Done, because there is a tendency to go toward economism. Oh, the whole economy is falling apart, so the crisis will produce its own contradictions such that we can win. That's not true, because fascism is rising all over the world. Or spontaneity will do it all. Spontaneity is absolute. There you go. Spontaneity, as we see, has happened in Minneapolis, is absolutely essential too for achieving demands, changing consciousness, and so forth. But that doesn't do it all. So there are all these things in between. And I guess one thing that I'm concerned about, especially, for example, with the police budget, is a really simple, at the simple level of how we say that. I say we should say it. I've been doing budget activism for years. But for fuck's sake, don't say, sorry, for bleep's sake, don't say we need to save money. Nobody needs to save money. Nobody needs to save money. It's just none of the money should go to them. The organized abandonment that characterizes neoliberalism around the world has got everybody convinced that the economic activity of a country or of a global industry is the same as the economic activity of me and my partner in our household. They have nothing to do with each other, even though we are dependent on it. So that's another point, as we're making our demands, however we make them, not to fall into the trap of parroting the notion that somehow the way capitalism saves capitalism from capitalism is that we all tighten our belts, and that the cops should tighten their belts too. We just don't want the cops. We want education, we want healthcare, so forth. So that's the end of my intervention.
Thank you all for taking that up. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everything that you've offered us this evening to kind of propel us forward toward the futures that we want and we need. And I really appreciate you all taking very seriously both kind of the thinking work we need to do to imagine the futures we want, as well as the doing work that we need to demonstrate how we want to get there, and the kind of unity of those that's required of us to make abolitionist futures possible. I also want to thank all of our speakers for bringing the goods tonight. Thank you, Ruthie, for staying up really late with us. Thank you, Emmy, for joining us first thing in the morning. And thank you, Mohamed, for sticking it out at the end of your workday. More thanks again to Nicolas for opening us up in such a good grounding way. If you want to stay connected to the organizations that bring you Friday Night Forums, please, I encourage you to check us out on Twitter and any of our other platforms. This is the last of this particular series of Friday Night Forums, as Nicolas mentioned at the jump. There may be more forthcoming. Please stay tuned. And as I mentioned in the chat, the Center for Political Education will follow up with an email that has links to resources that were mentioned tonight, including, the organizations that we're encouraging people to support during the kind of uprisings in Minneapolis. And with that, I'm going to bid everybody a fond good night. So please do stay tuned, and thank you for spending your recent Friday evenings with us. We really are so appreciative of everybody's engagement with these.